Today we're looking at the DeAndrea Army Brown guitar picks. These picks are quite old, occurring from the late 20s to the late 30s, much like the French mosaics made by DeAndrea that we've previously seen. What both these have in common is they show the diversity of shapes the company offered during this period of time. We have 56 models of picks shown here. I removed a lot of duplications. Those duplications I have in my collection because they show a variation from one pick shape to another pick shape. Even though the pick shapes are the same, it could be a gauge difference or a colored difference. But all those have been moved to the side just so we could take a look at all the different shapes here. A lot to talk about. Why don't we just start on the upper left here? Right here I've shown the catalog numbers 18, 23, and 24. They come out of the only and earliest catalog we have of DeAndrea from 1927. The company started 5 years earlier in 22. Already by that time they were up to 100 different pick shapes or more. And this pick shape of the 323 is also shown next to it, because that was undoubtedly in the 1920s, but removed. DeAndrea has several dozen empty blanks for catalog numbers from the 1927 catalog, because they tried them and they removed them. This is one of them, but later on it does show up as the 323. We have the 18, 23, and 24. These are all very distinct shapes. And many collectors can easily identify that and say, hey, that's something I want, that's cool, because I've never seen it before. And I get that. However, most of these picks would be overlooked by collectors simply because they are kind of dull and boring in appearance, that being the opinion of many. But it's not mine, because the mundane colors they may have is something that does attract me to them, and there is variations amongst them. I call them the Army Browns, but they also show up as the Army Greens as well. I suspected of all those guys that went to World War II, so many of them playing instruments, it left us with far more many people in the military playing instruments than civilians. And I just conjectured that perhaps these are the type of picks they would have been issued because they're camouflaged and they would suit their uniforms. But that's just a wild guess, and I'm not firm on that by any means. But the name Army Brown has stuck. So we see four distinct shapes up here at the upper left, as we noted. And this is getting a little confusing as we moved on here, because we show picks evolving, actually. In the 1927 catalog, this particular shape wasn't even shown. But sure enough, it does belong to the period of the 1920s, because by 1947, it's going to morph into the 362. Slight variance in shape, but basically the same shape if you look at it. And we'll see the actual 362 later on. But this is the precursor to the 362 in the 47 catalog. Now this is a 351 as we know it, but if you look at the shoulders here, you could tell this pick was clearly hand-stamped because they're asymmetrical, and that's how it shows up in the 27 catalog as well, in this asymmetrical form. So unless you're really getting to understand your DeAndrea catalogs and variations, this is something else you would overlook. You just toss or not even bother purchasing this pick because you didn't know it was one of the earlier DeAndrea picks. That's why I emphasize getting at least a visual impression of what those shapes were. Now later this shape would become known as the Lucas shape, but it was used by other people, including George Barnes. But it had a catalog number, and in the 27 catalog it was the 95, later changing to the 309, which was predominantly used for tortoiseshell picks. But I did want you to note the variations between this 351 and this 309 and this 347 here. they look so much alike, but they are different, so you could learn those nuances as well. Moving down to this group below these, we have experimental guitar picks. Certainly D'Andrea, because they're on the army brown, army green color spectrum. Clearly a large heart that they had clipped down. Here's another one that has been clipped down. It looked like a 352, possibly, that was clipped down. Another clear ice cream cone shape. Doesn't show up in any catalogs, neither of these three. Certainly D'Andrea, but experimental shapes. These as well. And these were certainly just crudely cut out. And someone worked with them, whether it was by D'Andrea, I don't know, or some civilian perhaps, which is entirely likely. But I do believe all these were actually D'Andrea experiments here. Going over here, we have, again, a diversity of shapes, 3 different sized triangles, a couple of different banjo picks here. Here's the 348 shape. And here's a cushion grip, the number 318. This actually had an elastic rubber band across it, much like that used in women's bras from the 1960s, which had the elastic in it. And the elastic wrapped around these 2 indentations here and was held in place. Vintage collectors know this pick, and it is highly sought after because it's so rare. Now, earlier I mentioned I removed the duplicate shapes. You may think you see some duplicate shapes down here, and it certainly does look like a few of them are duplicates at first glance. But let's just start making some comparisons and see how we could tell the difference. Let's suppose you thought these 2 shapes were the same, but wanted to verify that. I'd go ahead and I'd pick up the picks. I place one on top of another one, like that, and I move all the way to the right, the edges, into my fingers. Then I take a look to see if there's any variation left over on the other side, and sure enough there is. You could see right here that the pick on the bottom is actually a larger pick. So not the same 2 picks there at all. Again, this could be demonstrated with these 2 right here, which look similar, but when given the finger test, the edge placed all the way to the left, if I mentioned right before, that was a mistake. And again, we see one is larger than the other, so we know there are 2 different picks. And we also noted D'Andrea was missing many picks from their 100 series and 300 series catalogs, which they tried and pulled. And these are some of those missing picks. A few of those picks have been identified, but we could only say with the others that they are from those catalogs, but we don't know what numbers they are. Moving far over here to the right, we have 2 corrugated picks down here. We have a cork ring, a cork moon, and half grips, or half moon grips. And I want to point out a few things. We talked about D'Andrea making special shapes for certain groups that it includes cushion grip and tortoiseshell. Aside from that, when they put cork on these and they corrugated these, they used existing flat pick numbers to do that, and they just gave it a different catalog number, but it was the same shape. And in the future, I'll show you a diagram that simplifies that and just gives the flat pick numbers and makes a note as to whether they included cork or corrugation at any time. But I want to take a look at some of this corrugation here and see. Here's a very early corrugation. It comes into focus. 1920s, early 20s, and this is 1930s, early 30s. The corrugation changes, and if you see there, right there, there is an D'Andrea DA impression. Now, you don't see it too well here, but sure enough, it is there. I'd like to see if the camera could focus on that now. Oh, it's having difficulty. But that impression is certainly there. Maybe you can see it there. It's a D and A slightly to the right and down. And that's a feature many collectors would look for. So if you've been collecting guitar picks and you have some corrugated picks, you may inspect them closely to see if they have the impression. It could occur anywhere on the corrugated part, sometimes to left or right. The intention, of course, was to place it in the center, and we see a very good impression there. We got some other picks to the side that were duplicates, but there are over a dozen or so, but we're not going to go into them. I'm going to try to give you a good look at the difference between the Army Brown and Army Green, so you could see those variations. I'm going to use this piece of glass here, put a couple of the Army Greens to the side here, and a couple of Army Browns. And if you take a look at that, there you go. On the left, Army Greens, Army Browns. Very rare subdued group of DeAndrea picks. And I hope you soon start looking for them if you're a vintage collector. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.